Welcome everyone to today's webinar on mentorship, relationship quality definitions and measurement, research and community perspectives that we're going to be talking about. My name is Christina Rinaldi and I'm at the University of Alberta, and as such would like to acknowledge that I am located on Treaty 6 territory and I respect the histories, languages and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit and First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. And I also appreciate that you are or may be joining us from different territories. Through personal and professional reflection, I learn and continue to learn about the calls for action in response to TRC. I teach and research in complex, diverse, and changing contexts, and I'm committed to intentionally exploring and integrating different ways of knowing in my teaching, research, and service, and through an appreciation and respect of different worldviews and approaches to the work carried out, like the work from today. So a little bit about the Canadian Centre for Mentoring Research. Today's webinar is brought to you by the CCMR, and the work presented is also funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is a partner development grant that brought different organizations together and researchers together to conduct the work that we're going to be presenting. I want to say happy Monday, where we appreciate you taking the time to share the next hour with us, talking about mentoring relationship quality and what it means in both the research and practice community. But really quickly, a little bit about the center. It was founded in 2020, right in the midst of the pandemic. And as centers are popping up across the globe, we really did realize that Canadian researchers engaged in or interested in mentoring research needed a space of their own. Research can be an extremely collaborative process, but it also can feel daunting and isolated when first starting off, even overwhelming when we're in the weeds of it. And an example, the CCMR is there to help foster connections through the work. And today is an example of how that is brought together, because it is a team of academics and agencies and programs, and the work presented today will touch upon that. Our mission is to advance knowledge about youth mentoring in Canada by supporting and disseminating research, and it works with scholars to raise the profile of Canadian research. We know that there's research, as I mentioned before, that is across the globe, but we really want to showcase Canadian work in our communities. And we strive to connect research and practice and ultimately enhance the quality and effectiveness of youth mentoring with workshops and webinars and all the different things that we engage and disseminate. And then, of course, it was created by scholars from the U of A, the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, and Mentor Canada. All right. Who we are before we jump into what we did and what we'll be talking about. So I already kind of introduced myself. I'm the project director for the work on mentoring research, mentoring relationship quality. I mentioned I'm at the U of A, but I have fabulous co-presenters who I'm going to ask to briefly introduce themselves, and we will be taking certain portions and sharing that with you today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Howard. I'm a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and I am the Senior Research Assistant on the research that we'll be presenting to you today.
And I am Leah Broussard. I am a master's student at the University of Alberta, and I am a junior research assistant on this project.
And we are lucky to have Véronique Church Duplessis, who is joining us in the chat and who is there to help facilitate and when we do get to taking questions at the end or if anything pops up. So thanks, Véronique, for joining us in that capacity and supporting us. All right, on to today's overview. Really briefly, what we're going to spend time on, we're going to touch upon the research and mentorship and mentor relationship quality. We're going to have an activity to get your perspectives and views on mentorship. And then we're going to talk about the study, specifically the description and the types of questions that we asked the different programs that participated in phase 1. And we're going to present those study findings and talk about the next steps. And hopefully it will also involve you, your thoughts and input, and an interactive component. So I'm excited to get going. Away we go. So the value of mentoring. We are talking about a project that is looking at mentor relationships in childhood and adolescence. And if the pandemic taught us anything, not even before the pandemic, these are transitional periods of life, whether it means beginning school, starting school, moves. But the pandemic also brought to the forefront that our world is constantly changing, and we can't always expect when those changes do come about. And preventing negative outcomes during these periods of change or transition, or what we basically call life, is really essential. Youth mentoring programs are really well positioned to fill such needs for Canadian youth to counteract challenges that they may face. And we're going to speak specifically through the connection with other humans. And while youth mentoring programs, they prioritize improving social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes by pairing mentees with caring, supportive, and adult mentors. So the benefits of mentoring. What we know is that when we conceptualize high quality mentoring relationships, we know that they lead to the development of strong emotional connections, which lead to positive outcomes for youth. For example, when youth report high relationship quality in their mentor-mentee relationships, this is associated with and also has been found to reduce lower rates of aggression, while conversely higher rates of social skills are reported, effective coping strategies. And coping strategies is really an area that practitioners, whether you're in the field of education or in mental health, or in youth programming, we know that effective coping strategies have really signaled the way of how to promote resiliency. And then academic competence has also been increased and improved. So what is mentoring relationship quality? And the minute you put a word out like that, or a term out like quality, people are like, well, what does that mean? And we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about what that means for the programs that we talk to, and also what that means in the literature. But we're really getting to the crux of the work today. We are here to share the process by sifting through the research on mentoring relationship quality, and also going through the programs who's delivering mentoring work. So there are 3 phases of this work, but we really have to start off with a common ground. What are we talking about? Are we talking about the same things? And both Leah and Katie are going to help us explore whether we head in that direction. So understanding MRQ. Really generally, mentor relationship quality reflects the characteristics that create meaningful, positive mentor relationships. Well, what does that mean? Well, Canadian youth have been described as more socially engaged and educated and diverse than previous generations, but they also face, so both things are true, they also face unprecedented challenges. Youth are reporting social disconnection and mental health concerns at alarming rates, and these challenges have been reported higher for youth during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they really haven't come down that much. Maybe we're not out of it, but the consequences have been really complex. Access to supports are limited, disproportionately so for those impacted by socioeconomic status and diversity indicators. And we know that mentoring programs can help meet this need, but specifically at their core, mentoring programs are focused on offering youth supports through these relationships with caring adults. And we can't do that without the creation of strong emotional bonds. But what does that mean? In recent years, when we've been talking about strong emotional bonds, we really then have talked about, well, high quality mentoring relationships. And how does that promote youth health and well-being? So what practices do we have in place that acknowledge that there are things that we do to make mentoring meaningful and positive? And we won't leave you guessing for too long. So Leah, go ahead.
So before we continue with the presentation, we would just really love to get your kind of engagement in what mentoring relationship quality really means. So we're not going to give you, we'll jump in a little bit to what we found from our research, but I'm going to throw in the chat. Hopefully everyone is somewhat familiar with Jamboard. And if you're not, Veronique is going to be in the chat answering questions and dealing with any technical difficulties. But I'm going to throw this in the chat here to everyone. And so what you can do is you can click on this link in the chat and it'll open up a screen, a web page. And then on that web page, maybe Katie, I don't know if you want to open the web page as well, and then we can look at in live time at kind of the activity. So what we're hoping to get from all of you today is your thoughts on what characteristics, what traits, what qualities make a quality mentoring relationship. So if you're unfamiliar with Jamboard, how you can sort of navigate this is there's some sticky notes already up, and you can just click on a sticky note and type a response in. Also on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a spot to add additional sticky notes. And you can click on that and add your own stickies as well. But really, if you folks just want to kind of have at it and type in any different characteristics, traits, qualities, I see some coming up already, that you think foster quality mentorship. And I'll give you folks a couple of minutes to work through that, and then I'll bring us back in as a team. This is great. We're seeing lots. Also, if someone's put something that you also agree with, feel free to put it up again. Okay, I'll give everyone maybe like 30 more seconds to get your thoughts out there. This is great. We're seeing so much. Okay, last final call for any more stickies. Oh, I see one more popping up. Okay, awesome. Katie, do you want to leave this slide up for a little bit and we can just sort of look together as a group at at all of these responses that we have. So some of these are really small for me, so I'm just gonna bear with me while I try to read what they say. But I see trust, I see caring, I see being open-minded, patient, commitment, accountability. Some of the smaller ones, reciprocity, empathy, cultural competence, and humility. That's awesome. Conscientiousness, collaboration. I see more empathy coming up. Great. Okay, so we'll return to the presentation, but thank you all for your thoughts and your feedback. I think what we can see from this activity, and then also what we sort of saw from the research that we did, is that, sorry, Katie, next slide. Perfect. So from our research and our review of the literature, we've seen that MRQ plays an important role in creating solid mentoring relationships. However, we can see from our research and also from this little activity that we took together, organizations and people have many different ideas of what makes up MRQ and what makes a mentoring relationship really high quality. So one of the issues that we ran into when first developing and working through this study was how we should be defining MRQ, how we should be measuring MRQ, as the literature has many different ideas about how to do that and what that means. And obviously, as we're seeing today, real people in actual practice have differences in what they think quality mentoring relationships are as well.
So this all really brings us to our current study and why we're doing the research that we're doing. So overall, the current state of MRQ research literature really emphasizes the lack of clarity with respect to this concept. So while most researchers agree that MRQ is of considerable importance to promote positive outcomes among youth, it's characterized by significant inconsistencies, both in terms of overall definition and what those contributing factors might be. And when we think about what this inconsistency looks like, it's really representing a potential barrier for translating knowledge into evidence-based practice. So with this context, it becomes necessary to assess and understand whether Canadian mentoring programs perceive MRQ as being valuable to their practices and procedures, learn how they conceptualize MRQ, and gather information concerning their methods for evaluating this concept among mentors and mentees. So based on this framework, we developed the following research questions. First, how do Canadian mentoring programs document and assess mentorship relationship quality within their matches? And then secondly, to what extent do Canadian mentoring programs mentorship relationship quality assessment practices reflect information gained from theory and empirical research? So how much does what we know from the research align with what's happening in practice, more or less? So to answer our research questions, we first needed to develop a comprehensive understanding of the MRQ literature and really what the research base is telling us. So using that, we created a coding scheme that we could use to map our responses from community mentoring programs. To do this, we conducted an extensive literature review over the fall months of 2021, using the search terms of mentorship relationship quality and MRQ. For all articles published prior to November 2021. And this allowed us to come to a decision as to how to define MRQ as a whole for this research project and characterize the most notable contributing factors based on definitions and sample items that we saw reoccurring across multiple studies. Next, our research team consulted with our Project Advisory Committee, which is a consultative decision-making body composed of community partner representatives from Alberta Mentoring Partnership, Mentor Canada, and the University of Alberta, among other organizations as well. And from their input, we were provided with a list of community mentoring programs to contact them that we thought might be interested in participating. We then developed and distributed a brief MRQ documentation questionnaire that asked these program representatives about MRQ, whether they use the term at all. If so, how do they define it? How do they assess it and track it among mentors and mentees? We ended up distributing this questionnaire to 23 programs, and we received 13 responses in total. So we'll get into the results and from those responses shortly, as well as demographic characteristics of the participating organizations. So with that in mind, I first want to speak to the results of our literature review and then describe the coding scheme that we ultimately produced. So in terms of defining MRQ, we really followed this conceptualization where MRQ is composed of action-oriented processes that are more goal-oriented types of things, and then relational characteristics, which are underlying emotional traits associated with a mentoring relationship. So with respect to relational characteristics, there are many possible factors to consider, and there were often terms and definitions that overlapped with one another. So parsing out different concepts was challenging, but nonetheless, closeness between mentors and mentees, empathy for each other's perspectives, trust in one another, and satisfaction with the mentoring relationship are concepts that appear relatively frequently in the MRQ literature. Again, it's not always those terms used though. Other concepts like attunement or how attentive a mentor is to a mentoring relationship, as well as things like authenticity and compatibility, are also referenced in relation to MRQ, albeit to a slightly lesser extent. And then we also see definition challenges apply to action-oriented processes as well. So there are, but nonetheless, there are some concepts in this category that seem to best fit here, given their kind of concrete goal-driven nature. So support, which across studies is a term that's applied to various things. So problem solving, skill development, support with coping, that kind of thing, seems to be the most commonly referenced action-oriented process. But others that have received attention in this category include things like the extent to which a mentor is willing to dedicate their resources to the relationship. So things like time and energy, how well the mentor frames activities around the interests of the mentee. So we call this youth-centeredness. And then also how the mentee has improved or developed since participating in the mentorship relationship. So we're calling that growth here. And again, the goal here was really to try to identify concepts in the literature base that seem to best reflect MRQ across many studies. And this selection of characteristics is ultimately what we came up with. But certainly there are other things that were mentioned here and there, but this seems to kind of represent the majority of what is available. So before we get into the results, I want to provide you with a few more details about the programs who provided us with responses for this phase of our research. Our intention with this research is to be as representative as possible across Canada. So part of that involves trying to recruit organizations from different provinces. As you can see, about 54% of the participating organizations from this phase of the research reside in Ontario. But we are also fortunate to have organizations representing Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Quebec as well. And then likewise, we are striving to include organizations that reside in urban locales as well as rural communities. As you can see here, we have far more organizations from urban communities represented in this portion of the research at about 78%. But we are hoping to broaden our inclusion of rurally based programs in upcoming phases of our research. Lastly, before we kind of dive into the results, I wanted to give you an idea as to what our documentation questionnaire that we sent out to these program representatives actually looked like. For the most part, our questions kind of fit into one of four categories. So some questions reference matching procedures. So things like what considerations are taken into account when matching mentors and mentees, that kind of thing, for example. We also asked about how they define MRQ, or if they didn't have a formal definition, what is their conceptualization of a high quality mentoring relationship? In terms of documenting and tracking MRQ, we asked generally if they had a way to do this, but also more specifically whether they used a validated MRQ scale, because there are some out there, or if they don't assess the term MRQ, how do they assess and track the quality of their mentoring relationships? And also, what would they like to track moving forward if they want to add anything to their tracking procedures? Lastly, we asked them questions about what aspects of MRQ are important for them to track. So what's a priority for them? Again, if they lacked a formal MRQ definition, we wanted to know what kinds of things they prioritized in terms of quality high quality mentor-mentee relationships. And again, we're wanting to know whether there is something that they're not currently tracking, but they consider a high priority and they want to add to their assessment practices moving forward.
So now I'm going to walk you through the results of this documentation survey that Katie described. So as Katie mentioned, we did use a conceptual framework for our coding scheme that divided MRQ qualities into action-oriented and relational characteristics. So I'll start with action-oriented findings. So from the responses that we received from the participating organizations, those 13 organizations, Katie and myself categorized the terminology that was used by these organizations in those questions Katie was just describing to categorize the results. So as you can see from this graph, first and foremost, there's a lot of variability going on. Just like there was in the activity that we did together today, we do see that there's a wide range of terminology that's being used by these organizations. So overall, you can see that both support and growth seem to be the most prominent action-oriented responses that organizations considered when measuring the quality of the mentor-mentee matches that they had. Keep in mind there was 13 organizations that participated. And so we see support and growth as the most prominent, but again, only about 5 of those 13 organizations are referring to that term. Youth-centeredness, dependability, and dedication of resources were mentioned a little bit less so. So overall support and growth of the mentee seem to be what's coming out in terms of action-oriented characteristics of mentoring relationship quality. And then if we look at relational characteristics, so again, the results are pretty widespread. And interestingly, not as many programs seem to consider things like empathy, closeness, attunement, and authenticity in their matches. I also think that's really interesting because from our activity, even today that we just did as a group, empathy was something that came in quite a bit in a lot of those stickies. So I think it's interesting that in the organization's responses to our survey, we didn't really see anyone mentioning empathy. So compatibility seemed to be the big one that came out from relational characteristics. That one was mentioned again, more than others, but not necessarily often, because again, we had 13 responses and this was only a few people mentioning compatibility, also satisfaction and trust, which I do recall seeing from our activity together as well. So overall, it seems like compatibility and satisfaction and trust are the ones that are coming about from relational characteristics of mentoring relationship quality. As Katie mentioned, we also asked organizations how much they valued MRQ as an evaluation method for their matches. So if you're looking at on the left side of your screen, the more colorful graph, overall, there were some mixed results, but the majority of organizations did say that they found MRQ valuable to their matching and evaluation method. So about 69%. And then 8% were unsure and 23% were not prioritized. And by not prioritized, I think what Katie and I really saw in the results is that it's not necessarily not prioritized, but it's just that perhaps MRQ and that terminology and that more academic type of classification wasn't something that was familiar to them or wasn't something that they prioritized, but they did obviously care about the quality of the relationships in their mentorships, just maybe not with the formal definition of MRQ. And then on the other pie graph that's basically just a yellowish orange circle, we see very similar to what we as a research team found in the literature. All participating organizations had no formal definition of MRQ, which makes it something very hard to tangibly evaluate and measure in their matches if they don't have a clear definition for what MRQ is. So again, in our literature review, we found many definitions and many ideas of what MRQ could be. We also obviously saw that in our little activity, our short activity today. So it's clear that across the board, this is kind of an area that needs some clarification, both for the academic research and literature on MRQ, and also for organizations who are actually looking at relationship qualities when making their matches. And then finally, we also looked at how these mentoring organizations assessed mentoring relationship quality. So 31% of organizations had no formal evaluation or assessment process, and another 31% did do scheduled check-ins with mentors and mentees to see how the match was going broadly. It's really nice to see that about 15% of organizations did use validated MRQ scales to get quantifiable data on how the match was going. As Katie mentioned, there are some scales out there to be used. But yeah, so overall, we're seeing kind of a split in how programs are assessing MRQ and measuring it.
Okay, so with those results in mind, we think about and discuss what those findings actually mean. So it seems like there is a disconnect between research and practice for MRQ. We know that researchers suggest that this is something that is really crucially important for mentoring, to see some of those mentoring outcomes that Christina spoke of at the beginning of the webinar. But it just doesn't seem to be something that is reliably tracked in practice in spite of this. And furthermore, the inconsistency that characterizes the literature seems to extend to practice, like Leah was saying. So we're seeing that the challenges programs face in defining MRQ is also reflected in their lack of or inconsistent assessment practices. So for instance, kind of what Leah referenced earlier, in the case of one program that sent us responses, they mentioned in their survey that MRQ isn't a priority for them, but at the same time, in other questions, they clearly referenced that they value compatibility, support, and growth in mentoring relationships, which our research tells us that is part of MRQ. So there's just some inconsistency in that kind of understanding there. Ultimately, the data collected thus far really suggests that the overall definition and theoretical determinants, or those contributing factors of MRQ, are still unclear, or at least they're not agreed on. And as a result, this inconsistency, again, is really acting as a barrier for translating knowledge on this topic into mentoring practice.
Okay, so where are we at in this larger research project? And again, why are we even engaging in this? Why do we feel it's important? I think we've been giving hints all along as to why it might be, but I'll try to bring it all together. So phase one of this partnership work on mentoring relationship quality has engaged those different organizations through work with an advisory committee. With Mentor Canada, Alberta Mentoring Partnership, and different academic university researchers from across Canada and the U of A. We engaged in the first phase, which was to, we presented already the literature and search from that perspective of what the terms are, the different kinds. Then we surveyed these organizations and what they've been doing, and even just to have your input today has been really helpful for us, because what do we do with this coding and these different kinds of themes and definitions, and how do we track it? Well, we are going to use that. We have a sense of what is happening with organizations and programs, and the breadth and maybe the variability of how they're using and implementing this idea called relationship quality. And now we're going to go to the mentors and mentees in phase two, and we're looking to survey about 300. We've already launched, in other words, our survey to get mentors and mentees from across. So these are not matched mentors and mentees. We want to separately recruit mentors and mentees so they don't have to be in the same relationship across Canada. I'm hoping that we can, if you're interested, you are welcome to distribute on our behalf as well. We have a QR code and how mentors and mentees can sign up for this, but we're aiming to ask them about what is important. The concepts that we've heard about: relatedness, closeness, trust, and maybe even understand a little bit of relationship challenges. And then we're trying to examine the feasibility of incorporating relationship quality practices based on the recommendations generated from this activity. Because with a subset of participants who fill out the surveys, we are going to interview them and explore that further. So what really hits home for them, what really is important for that human connection that we said is important, and what comes out as quality. When we're talking about that, we mean when people connect. That's an indication of quality. And perhaps what are some of the pieces that are not allowing those connections to take place. The intent is to take what we learn from our project phases from the mentors and mentees, and eventually develop resources, which is phase 3, when we actually run focus groups and test for feasibility. What we found from both the organizations and the mentors and mentees themselves is, can we develop some resources to provide and incorporate relationship building practices in the tracking, for sure, which is what we spent a little bit of time today, is how are we monitoring, how are organizations and programs actually looking at this, but then also in the supporting side. In other words, it's easy to say, well, you need to show empathy or you need to build a trusting relationship. I think we need examples for some mentors who might be saying, well, how do I do that? And giving them tools and strategies for achieving just that, and being authentic, which is not just say, yes, I'll be authentic. What does it mean to be authentic in those relationships? And it does take a little bit of work. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to all. And I think we hope to inform both of those pieces. So, future directions. The idea is that MRQ is definitely touted as being instrumental in promoting lasting relationships, quality relationships, healthy relationships, that in turn lead to better youth outcomes and well-being, which is something we're also tracking. What are some of the ways to promote this relationship quality features and to enhance activities that are feasible? Because we understand that it has to also be feasible for it to be integrated and implemented. We'd like to know also, what are your thoughts? And now that we know what else is out there and that you're thinking about it really, and bringing in some of from the initial activity that Leah facilitated, you clearly are on the mark when it comes to describing the features of quality, healthy relationships. And so any ideas or thoughts about how programs, when they are actually successful at doing that, or what might be some of the limitations? It would be great to open this up, or even just general kinds of ideas and questions before we move on to the broader discussion, but is really to hear from you at this point with respect to the success or your even experiences with MRQ, whether it's that term specifically, as Katie mentioned, which people don't really tend to use a lot, but we're all talking about the same kind of thing. And the purpose of a lot of research, in order to make a difference, is to have shared language and commonality to see that we're actually moving forward on similar path. Thanks for sharing the next phase study links, Veronique, in the chat. And we can open it up. And Leah and Katie, is there anything else to add to the two ideas between tracking and promoting the activities that I might have missed, or we're good?
I don't think so. I think overall, we're just really curious to hear from you folks about what you think from this presentation. If what we got from the 13 organizations that we recruited, if that's if that's something similar to what you've seen in your own practice, how you go about measuring relationship quality, and what Christina said, what you find successful for your organizations or for your practice, and what maybe are some barriers that you face in actually tracking relationship quality. So feel free to, I think Veronique will probably facilitate any discussion, but you can throw things in the chat. You can raise your hand as well with the functions on Zoom, but yeah.
Thanks, Christina, Katie, and Leah. We have some questions coming in. So you have 3 ways to ask your questions. We're pretty flexible today. You can either use the chat if that's easiest for you. Someone just put a question in the Q&A, so we'll go there in a second. But we also have a manageable group today. So if you want to raise your hand, just unmute and ask your question. You can also do that, and we'll give you the opportunity to speak. So that being said, we have a question from an anonymous attendee, wondering if the inconsistent definitions of MRQ might actually be a strength rather than a challenge. For example, there are likely some common features on high quality relationships that can be generalized across contexts, but I'm wondering if we need a more flexible definition or understanding of MRQ that is responsive to the diverse mentoring context across Canada. Just thinking that quality will look and feel very different for people, and maybe that's okay. So I don't know if anybody wants to take that on.
No, for sure. I think the variability is not, that's a great way to frame it, is not necessarily, it is a challenge, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that it really is from the perspectives of the mentees and mentors, although they do bring 2 different kinds of perspectives to the relationship, in what they value and what they take away. Bottom line is, I think we want those relationships to feel, there's some elements, I believe, that we do want them to, how they achieve it might be different, but we do want closeness. We do want some things that I think are maybe essential, like something like trust. So maybe some of the other pieces, or feeling safe and respected in those relationships, are universal, are a given, but maybe how they look can vary, and appreciate the question and the consideration of context are really different, and that they don't look the same across all programs. So thanks for pushing us a little bit with that question as well. Leah and Katie, any thoughts, given that you know, you spent some time on those coding schemes and going through the responses?
Yeah, I was going to mention, and Katie and I, as we mentioned, Katie and I were the ones that kind of looked at the responses from the organizations, and then had to take those responses and kind of quantifiably group them. But I will say that the anonymous question, the point about that this may look different for different populations and different people and different programs. I think we did see that as well. Like in the responses, sometimes there was an explicit mention of a word such as trust, and sometimes the response itself was a little more describing something that we would quantify as trust. And so we sort of had to use our best judgment when grouping the terminology that we saw, because as you're suggesting, there are many different ways to conceptualize things like trust and things like closeness and attunement and those types of things. And so what Katie and I really tried to capture in the coding scheme is a term that best represents those processes and those mechanisms that are happening, regardless of whether the term was actually used. I hope that makes sense. Like, so regardless of whether trust was stated explicitly or if trust was just described, we would sort of group it that way. But I do think, yeah, it's great to think about the variability and the sort of differences that we're seeing across programs and across definitions as a strength. I think that's a really interesting perspective to look at. And of course, as researchers, we sort of see it as a little bit of a challenge, because We're wanting some like really nice, clean, clear-cut data, but at the end of the day, we're working with real people. And so there's so many differences that we can see that isn't going to give us just like clear-cut, nice, beautiful data and bar graphs. So yes, I really appreciate that comment, that question.
I'll add to that as well. I think one of the things we're really trying to do with this research, and definitely with the phases of research down the road and the one we're doing right now, we're really trying to be as representative as possible of like lots of different programs across Canada, urban and rural communities. Like we really want to see how all these different kinds of programs conceptualize this term and think about the things that go into it. So certainly, in addition to kind of what the question was saying about strengths there, we want to see what that looks like too. Like that's part of this research, is figuring out where does MRQ stand across all of these different programs, and what can we do to be as representative as possible with that. So I just wanted to add that in.
And hopefully that variability would also inform a breadth of resources eventually. That's the intent, is to help and support programs in their ability to deliver and facilitate whatever that. And I think we started off with that quality means different things to different people. But with the intent that this just has positive outcomes for youth in their well-being and overall dealing with a lot of the things that life really brings along. And as of late, it seems to be this disconnection that we're all talking about.
Thank you, Christina, Leah, and Katie. We still have time for more questions, so please go ahead and ask them. In the meantime, while we wait for more questions to come in, something has been striking me over the past couple of months while you've been working on this project, since I've seen some of the early findings. And it's this distinction you've introduced of action-oriented and relational characteristics, which I don't recall seeing very often laid out in literature. And, going back to the earliest conceptions of mentoring relationship quality of MRQ, I think if I go back to, the model that Jean Rhodes proposed in the early 2000s, there were 3 components, right? Mutuality, trust, and empathy. All of those are relational characteristics. So if I might ask for you to expand maybe a little bit on that action-oriented component you're introducing to relationship quality, and what that might mean for future conceptualization of relationship quality for programs and researchers.
I can start if everybody else is okay with that. So I think it's a really neat concept and a neat way of conceptualizing relationship quality, because I think if you just think of a relationship, and if you think of a quality relationship, you automatically go in that relational characteristic route. So you start thinking about things like trust and empathy and compassion and those types of things. But with these specific types of relationships between mentors and mentees, I think that action-oriented piece does play a big role. So things like support and dedication of resources. How is a mentor supporting a mentee's goals? Are there tangible steps that a mentor is taking with their mentee to help them achieve and accomplish some goals that they've maybe set out? Because a lot of these relationships, of course, the mentees and the mentors both are looking for those relational characteristics, that warmth, that trust, those types of things. But I think also with those relationships, they can really be used as a sort of stepping stone for the youth and for the mentees to expand their horizons. Maybe they're interested in looking at certain jobs. Maybe they're interested in pursuing certain careers and education and things like that the mentor can actionably help them take steps towards. So I think, yeah, that's a big component that we really liked to see as a part of quality relationships and not just the typical things that you think of with relationships. But I'd love to open the floor, of course, to Christina and Katie, and also to anybody attending today on their thoughts about that action-oriented versus relational split, because that's a great question.
Well, I think our results actually showed that programs are more comfortable with tracking and monitoring, or just even looking at things like the action-oriented pieces, such as the support and growth. And it's not to say all of them were doing that, but they seem to be more so than those relational components, which we are saying has been around longer and seems to be at the core. But when it comes to those action ones, maybe they're also related to the type of programming and program goals that draws certain kinds of mentors and mentees. Leah, you hinted at, you know, if this is very specifically to connect with other leaders in your area or other youth who are looking for a specific piece, like how to be a leader, or looking at a career in science, or there's different kinds of programs, those might be more clear cut. But it is just interesting that they might just seem a little bit more tangible, something that we don't have as much variability. Again, not saying that that's better or not, just different. And yet at the same time, thanks for the observation, Veronique, that perhaps it isn't necessarily being seen as the two components that we need to, whether it's track or think about or reflect upon, and the value for programs for each.
Thanks, Katie. I don't know if you want to add anything. If you do, please unmute. I think that, you know, we can start looking at wrapping this webinar up to give people time to get ready for their next meetings and so on. Since, you know, we often get back-to-back meetings, I'll take a second to thank Christina, Leah, and Katie for bringing the findings today and sharing them through the Canadian Centre for Mentoring Research platform. I'm here as a staff member of Mentor Canada that is also supporting the Canadian Centre for Mentoring Research with the Alberta Mentoring Partnership and academics at the University of Alberta. So this is a collective endeavor, and glad to see what can be showcased when we all work together to bring new research to practitioners and to learn from practitioners to inform future directions for research as well. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Christina, Leah, and Katie for presenting, and I'll hand it back to Christina for last words.
Well, I just really happy to have been able to share this work, and it doesn't happen quickly, but it's always exciting to get feedback from practitioners and from different programs. And also we're excited about the next phase, obviously, to talk to mentors and mentees as well, and then to bring it all back and tease it all apart at the end. But thank you for your participation today. And if there are additional questions, we would love to receive them. It was an intimate, I'd say, group, so we can definitely handle follow-up questions if there are any thoughts, input. And I'll have you take away that duality of action versus the relational pieces. If you have anything to contribute or thoughts on that, we welcome that, and thank you for